My name is Brett Bruin, and I'm a recovering White House staffer and diplomat. And really glad to invite some former colleagues to share their stories, which are captured in this great book, West Wingers, which is available just as you're exiting. So pick up a copy. What it is, I think, actually is a compilation of inspirational stories from young people and people that are young at heart.
That was for me. I just want to point that out.
No specific people identified with those remarks about the experience of working in this amazing place and for amazing people. Obviously the president, but there are, from the vice president, first lady, second lady, and on down, were just so many amazing individuals and so many Herculean efforts to, whether it's on healthcare.gov or on advancing the rights for minority groups. It seems like a really different time. It seems like a more hopeful time. I'm not making a political statement. But I think it really also is valuable as we confront what kind of country we are now and where we're going. So I really don't want to belabor this, just to say how great it is to have these folks here to share their stories. Please do engage them. And to be in an organization that also, I think, is equally inspirational in its mission. For those that don't know, and I will not steal the thunder for Dr. Clinton, Cultural Vistas is an organization that when I was working in public diplomacy really stood out as one that was trying to innovate in how to bring people around the world together. So you were here in their headquarters, and really grateful for them to open their doors literally and figuratively to this event. And so without further ado, Ben.
Also do my best to project. Really great to have you here this evening. As Brett said, Cultural Vistas is in the space of shaping future leaders through international exchange programs. We provide opportunities for young people to come and spend time in the United States, doing internships, traineeships, and really learning about the American workplace, about American culture. So it is so exciting for me to be amongst such a distinguished group of leaders. Young and emerging and more advanced. So just thrilled to have you here. And really want to kind of get started. I'll ask each of our panelists, very distinguished panelists, to tell us a little bit about themselves when we go through some introductions in terms of kind of what their role was in the White House and what they're doing now. But I do want to start with the brains behind this book, this great book that I've been really incredibly inspired by reading, and just want to make the comment that particularly during this election season right now, I think it really does inspire people to look at themselves basically in the mirror and say, what can I do? Because the people before us that are here tonight ask that question of themselves and continue to ask that question of themselves, and all come from very modest backgrounds and have made a tremendous difference in our world and what our world looks like today. So again, I will start with Gautam to tell us a little bit about why this book, why the people you selected, and why now.
Sure. Are folks fine without me using the mic, or would you prefer that I use the mic? No, I'm good.
Wait, try the mic.
What?
Try the mic.
Would you prefer that? Whoa. Would you prefer that I use the mic? Then I will use the mic. Okay. Folks in the back. Thank you for having us. It's an honor to be with you. Really appreciate you coming together, even though traffic out there is pretty rough right now. And it's so reassuring and inspiring to be with people who believe and value leadership and diplomacy and public service, all of which we need a lot more of these days and in the days ahead. So as to the why of this question, it actually has to do with the election, which is the 2016 election. If that election had gone another way, to be frank, we probably would not have put this book together. In a lot of ways, this was a project that was in response to that election, but more importantly, the sort of transition that followed that election. And I won't get super political. Is this cutting out on me, or are you guys okay? Okay, it just sounds weird up here. So in the aftermath of the 2016 election, a couple things changed. So one is that a lot of the folks who wrote in this book found themselves on the outside. So we had a lot of time to think and reflect and really try to put into words what made our experience interesting and special. If you ask, I think any of us, and I'll speak for the group, but tell me if you disagree, if you ask us what we miss most about working in the Obama White House, it would not necessarily be the president and first lady, although we miss them every day and are glad that they're safe, but that we really miss the people that we work with. I grew up watching The West Wing. I remember in college watching that show and being like, oh, I want to be like Sam Seaborn. And later realized once I got there, I really want to be like CJ Craig. For those of you who are fans of the show, you know what I'm talking about. But it was this whole idea of this aspirational, hopeful vision of government and public service that really attracted me to the idea of politics and campaigns and government in the first place. And when I got there, I found that, the show got a lot wrong in terms of it. The day-to-day was far less glamorous, but they got that part about the people right, sort of the cast that surrounded the president, about how patriotic and talented and how much they cared about giving back to their country and how they all had their own stories behind the policy work they did or the political things they worked on. And so as we saw this transition happening, a part of this was wanting to capture what made that experience so special. And a part of it was trying to really find a way to also capture the spirit of public service. And, without getting explicitly political, I think what we've seen over the last 18 months is a change in the way that we talk about public service in this country. The way we sort of, I won't say we, but how some people out there demonize public servants and sort of scapegoat bureaucracy or the deep state, whatever you want to call it. Instead of the West Wing, we have House of Cards and Scandal these days. So a part of it was also trying to find a way to just tell the story of what it means to work within the White House, to be there to see history and in some cases to help shape it, and what we learned about being on the inside and how that can hopefully be a roadmap for the future.
Awesome, thank you. Brad, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you found yourself working in the White House, maybe a highlight or two, and kind of what inspired you to contribute to the book?
So I tend to talk a lot, so I will try to keep it very brief. So how I ended up working at the White House, I think it starts with, as I think a lot of folks on stage when we do these book events, it's the first time you saw Barack Obama speak, which is 2004. And I was living in New York at the time. And when he gave that speech about bringing the country together and that we're not red states or blue states, it really felt like he was talking to me. Like I was this weird half black, half Korean kid, Blasian, incognito, as I like to say, watching the screen. And I really felt for the first time in my life that this was a person literally speaking to me. And that speech made me believe that, one, I was a part of the American story because this skinny guy with the big ears was on stage, captivating the country. But two, not only was I part of the story, that once he announced his candidacy to run, that I had to get off my ass and get involved. Because so much of his speech and so much of his rhetoric on the campaign was, I can't win without you. It's not just incognito boy on the couch, I want you to get involved. It was, I can't win as president unless you, Brad Jenkins, do something. And I think there's a whole generation of not just young people, but our most active volunteers in the Obama campaign were not young people. They were actually moms and retirees and former teachers. And so it was incredible just being a part of that movement. So many of us who got involved never were involved in politics before. I'd never volunteered on a campaign. I'd never been involved in a campaign. And if you would have told me going to my first volunteer event that I would somehow work at the White House and it would be the Obama White House, I would have thought you were crazy because Hillary Clinton was up on Barack, I think 30 points at the time. So yeah, and I completely agree with Gautam. I think, it was such a privilege and an honor not only to work for President Obama, but just to serve. As I like to say, every day working at the White House, the people that we welcomed, it was their greatest day of their lives. So it was really hard not to be sappy and like cry every day because so much of our job was honoring people and thanking them for the incredible work that they do. And an old Clinton White House friend told me that the day that you don't have goosebumps walking into work every day is the day that you should just quit, because there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who are just as talented as you and just as committed, and who would understand to Gautam's point, incredible privilege and responsibility to serve the American people. And I do think that for those of you who haven't read the book, read it, because it will get you fired up before this election. I'll tell you that, because the people, as Gautam said, are so inspiring, and I cry. I mean, every anecdote, again, I'm a sap, as you can see, but every anecdote, I cry because I know these are the stories we need to be reading about, right? These true vignettes of, it's probably the most diverse White House memoir in history, but just really fired up good people doing the best that they can and being thrown into this incredible White House. So that's it for me.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Lynn, you are doing in your time at the White House, you worked a lot on violence against women. Love for you to talk to us a little bit about that. And also, we are in an incredible time right now where this topic is so front and center. Can you share a little bit about kind of what you did while you were in the White House and how that's translated now in a very different time to what you're doing now?
Well, and I was thinking I was laughing about the age thing, because it's the first time it's been so blatant, like, why are there all these young people in Lynn? But it's been in the back of my mind each time we've done these talks. And, I think that is because in the intervening 8 years since I was appointed as the White House advisor, there's been a tremendous influx of young women into this sector of work on violence against women. But at that time, there was less so. And we all wrote about how we were unlikely people to be in the White House, but truthfully, I'm among the most unlikely. I was a feminist activist. I write in the book about how I came up in the women's movement. I used to camp out in abortion clinics in the bombing days. We put big signs on the roof that said, "Don't bomb us." I mean, I come from like the barricades. And so the idea that I would ever be in the White House is equally as unlikely. And I came in through policy, not politics, in my work. And after I left the abortion rights field and worked in women's health care, I then went over to work in the battered women's shelter in Tallahassee, Florida, serving 8 rural counties where, battered women had to drive hundreds of miles to get to safety or get a rape kit. And so I really come from those grassroots. And so President Obama had made a commitment to have a White House advisor on violence against women. He was challenged sort of about this repeatedly on the campaign trail by my people out there working, who always got their way into events and said, "What about domestic violence?" And the president had a great track record on this issue in Illinois, had done some really groundbreaking work. And so, of course, when we saw Joe Biden on the ticket, we knew, as the father of the Violence Against Women Act, that there'd be a real focus on this issue. I was the first ever White House advisor on violence against women, so I had to sort of make it up as I went along. I worked for Vice President Biden because of his leadership role, but I also had an interesting position in that I also sort of reported to Valerie Jarrett in the White House Council on Women and Girls and worked very closely with Valerie and Tina. So it was a great experience to sort of be representing the principal of the vice president and then to also have these relationships on the other side of the driveway. And so my job, which took me about a year to figure out, I do often tell the story about how the first year I was sure I was going to be fired at any second. Really, I did. I thought every day I would walk in, and one day my badge didn't work at the gates, bing, bing, and it's like, so I was like, that's it, I'm fired. And then I convinced the Secret Service to let me in. And then by some bizarre quirk of fate, I get up to my office in the EEOB. I had one of those tiny little offices on the first floor. And the doors had been pulled shut and the lock had been spun around and I didn't know the code at all. So I couldn't get into my office on that same day. And my friend at the Secret Service desk right there said, Lynn, I've seen this before. That means you're out. Not knowing, of course, that was my biggest fear, that I was fired indeed. But my job really was to be, I often say, a community organizer within the federal government. It was perfect for sort of learning from President Obama, because my job really was to bring federal agencies together and create this whole of government response to violence against women. So we had 20 agencies or more that were involved in creating a portfolio of programs to address domestic violence and sexual assault. So on our work on sexual assault, you probably saw the most of it on our campus sexual assault work. President Obama was very involved in that. It came to the White House Council on Women and Girls and the Vice President's office, but it also involved many other federal agencies. We also worked on sexual violence in the Peace Corps. We worked on sexual violence on tribal lands. We worked on sexual violence kind of across the board. So I write about that in my chapter, and some of the highlights for me are the things that you probably never heard about. The campus sexual assault issue is well covered. I think we made big changes on college campuses. We got campuses to respond. President Obama and Vice President Biden challenged them to do so, and many of them have made those changes. Of course, we're now seeing those changes rolled back by the Trump administration. It's a little bit heartbreaking, because just as colleges and universities are starting to get it, and we see that happening, well, we're going to see a backwards turn. But some of the things we did that you probably never read about were things that affected people's lives in everyday communities. So we had a project addressing HIV/AIDS and violence against women. And this was the brainchild of a guy named James Albino, who worked in the Domestic Policy Council. And he said, you know what, our national AIDS strategy barely mentions women. Why is that? We had made a major investment in it. And here we were talking about a quarter of the epidemic, which is women and HIV/AIDS, and often driven by the trauma of domestic violence and sexual assault. So we developed a plan, we brought agencies together, and we created programs in communities that these women's organizations are still working on. So I feel really good about that. And I think we changed the national conversation. So we teed it up for what we see today. And we brought, as I said, a ton of young women into this sector, and that really inspires me.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Raina, would love to hear a little bit more about your background. Raina is from Alaska and worked in the White House, the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, on tribal issues and advised on climate change. So would love to hear a little bit about your experience and maybe what you're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having us tonight, for coming despite the horrible traffic outside. I'm from Alaska. If you've read the book, you probably know which chapter is my chapter. It's called Alaska. But when my path to the White House was actually pretty circuitous, and as most of the folks in this panel, pretty unlikely, I grew up in Alaska, not just Alaska, but rural Alaska. Has anybody here been to the state? A few people have been, okay. So those who've been there understand that there's Anchorage, and there's basically everywhere else outside of Alaska. So it's tiny little villages that you've got to fly to, and not on an airliner. I mean, fly to on like a 4-seater airplane, a Cessna airplane, and that's how we get around. So I grew up in that version of rural Alaska, in an Alaska Native family. I've been in Athabascan and Yupik, which are two indigenous groups of the state, now known as Alaska. And so growing up, I always knew I was going to go to college. I always knew I wanted to kind of get outside of Alaska and break free of where I'd come from a little bit and experience some things. But for me, it was unlikely, because my parents, I was a first-generation college student, and beyond that, my grandparents, who were 3 of the 4 of them are indigenous from Alaska. 2 of my grandparents out of the 4 didn't ever learn to read or write English. So it's like going from that to college education in one generation just seems extremely difficult. And it was difficult, but I feel like for me, for whatever reason, I had this urge to kind of get outside and experience other things. And so I actually ended up as a first-generation college student, to my parents' surprise, going to Yale for undergrad and then Harvard for grad school. And after that experience at the Kennedy School of Public Policy, I, of course, as is typical for students from that program, kind of migrated down to DC. I was extremely happy to be there when Barack Obama became president. And so I had the opportunity at that point, just kind of by happenstance, and because I'd interned at this office in the past, but I ended up getting a job offer at OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. And so I worked on tribal issues when I first got to OMB, and then I kind of decided to branch out a little bit and spent most of my time there working on international affairs issues. So I handled consular affairs, I handled U.S. Institute of Peace, I handled the Syria budget when Syria was going awry. And so I had that experience. And I did that for a few years, and I really enjoyed my time there. I really enjoyed what I was able to learn doing international affairs, traveling to our embassies abroad, especially in the war zones, and getting to see what we're spending our dollars on, just infrastructure-wise and all the manpower that we have out there. But at a certain point, after a few years, about year 5, I decided that I wanted to switch back and kind of go back to my roots, which is working on Indigenous issues, which is not without an international nexus, but I decided to kind of go back to that. And so at that point, I had the opportunity to move offices within the White House and join this lovely, amazing crew, and very, very proud to call them colleagues. And there I was the president's liaison to tribes. And so a few really, really amazing moments. I won't talk about the one in the book, which is the trip where I brought him to Alaska to talk about climate change. But I'll talk about a trip that was my first one with him about 6 months after I started in intergovernmental affairs. We had the opportunity to bring him on his first trip to Indian country. And so we chose, and this is before the no DAPL stuff, this is before all of that. It was June 2014, and we happened to bring him to Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota for several reasons. One, because they happened to have a big event at the same time that we were targeting, and so it just kind of worked out. But when we went out there, me not really understanding how to even organize a presidential visit to anywhere, was sort of relying on the input from various folks. And the number one piece of input was he loves to sit down with kids, like make sure there's a component with youth where he can talk to them. And so, that was great because, tribal communities, we love having events for our youth and encouraging them and propping them up. So we talked to the chairman, who was Dave Archambault at the time, and we said, listen, we need like a small, like a round table, intimate, just a conversation. And we thought it'd be like half an hour maybe, and then we, bring him out to the main stage. We'd have this big speech, and we'd kind of all head out of there. And so they gave us these 6 kids. They were kind of the middle of the road kids. They weren't the valedictorians. They weren't the MVPs. We wanted like a cross section of your typical young person on the reservation. And before we departed, we got notice about a week before we went on the trip that it wasn't just going to be the president, but the first lady would be joining him because they were going on their way to Palm Springs for vacation. And that may sound typical, but they only travel together about 3 times a year for official business. And so it was incredibly exciting for me that my first trip, they were both going to be there. And so when we got there, we did kind of all the typical stuff with, introducing him to all the leadership and going through the photo line and all of that. But then we kind of ushered them into this little tiny elementary school classroom at the elementary school and sat them down. And of course, there are 6 young people in there from ages 14 to 18. These are kids, some of whom have never been off the reservation, who've never been on a plane. And the president and first lady come in and sit down with them. And they'd been waiting for about 3 hours at that point. And they were like absolutely terrified. I could just like feel the tension in that room when they went in. I was like, oh man, this is gonna be a quick meeting. And so we kind of sat outside. There was nobody else in the room except for the photographer, Pete Souza. And we waited, half an hour, kind of creeps up, half an hour passes. We continue to wait, 45 minutes passes, then 50 minutes, and then all of a sudden it's been over an hour and they're still not out of the room. And so at that point we start getting really concerned. And we're like, what's happening in there? And so I think we sent Marvin in there actually to go check it out, who is the president's kind of like right-hand man. So he goes in there, he sits for a little bit, and all of a sudden we hear this drumming and singing from within the room, like native drumming and native singing. And we were like, oh wow, what's happening? And then the moment that the president and first lady came out of that room, when they emerged from that room, I've never seen that expression on their faces before, and I don't think I've ever seen it since, where it was just like they were stricken by their experience, by what they'd heard. And I felt like they were like barely keeping it together. And it was an amazing moment because shortly thereafter, they got back on Air Force One after their speech and all of that. But before they did that, they were, the president was so upset. He thought he couldn't get through his speech, and he actually was like thinking about canceling it because he didn't think he could do it. He did it, of course, because that's what he does. But then when they got back on Air Force One after that, they just totally broke down crying and basically shared with the entire senior staff what their experience had been. And the president had said, we're going to meet next week and talk about this. But I was like, okay, maybe that'll happen. But literally the day after he got back, he called us all in to the office and basically said, I didn't know things were so bad for kids out on the reservation. Like, they're so hopeful and they're so wonderful and they're so authentic, and they're just speaking their truth. But the truth they're speaking about is not what should exist in this country. And then he started, just like tearing up, and we all just started crying. But it just reminded me of who he is, and it confirmed me who he is. He's somebody who, at that point, it was about 7 or 8 years in office, he had never lost his ability to feel and to be sensitive to the needs of people throughout the country, and was especially impacted by youth. And I feel like somebody who hears that many bad things on a daily basis, it was a pretty profound moment for me that spoke to his character and the First Lady's character. And I just, I didn't even realize until that point that politicians and leaders like the Obamas existed. So I just wanted to share that story.
Thank you. So each of you played a critical role in advancing the Obama administration's efforts on public engagement. So the expertise that we have here is incredible. And as we think about, many of us in the room are working on issues that require a lot of public engagement and communicating to audiences that are fairly difficult to, number one, understand or kind of find the right balance. We at Cultural Vistas are struggling now with making the case for international exchange in a space and a time when all things international are being questioned. So we struggle with that. How do we engage the American public around this? So I'd love your advice to us in the room of, given the dynamics that we see today, we think about who is the American public, how do we get smarter and how do we learn from you of how to engage the American public or publics in a way that can advance what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah. So I realized I didn't talk at all about what I did at the White House, but this ties very well. So my time at the White House, I worked, as you mentioned, in the Office of Public Engagement in Valerie Jarrett's office, and a lot of my job was figuring out how to do just that, which was how do you tell a story? I think it's very easy to tell a story on a campaign because campaigns are easy, right? It's a horse race. There's an end game in sight, and getting people to vote is a lot easier than educating people about the debt ceiling or non-defense discretionary budgets. It's a lot more complicated. And so my job was how do you do that? How do you actually educate, and then also in some cases mobilize people to take action or do something? And I think we were dealing with this at a time where we would read the polls, and now it seems funny because at the time we're like, man, people's faith in institutions are really falling. People aren't trusting the media and political parties and institutions. And I was like, wow, if only we knew how far that degradation would go. But we really relied on it, and my portfolio was the creative community, because there's one thing that, particularly for young people, America's really good at telling stories. That's probably like our only cultural export at this point. We know how to tell stories. Unfortunately, most of those stories are superhero stories. but they are like billion-dollar empires. And I think that what Barack Obama did in that 2008 campaign was he told a story of America, and he told a story that led to the highest youth vote totals in history. And he told a story that was inclusive, and he told a story that was aspirational. And regardless of the issue that you all are working on or campaigns that you're working on, I think that entertainment, that's something that I personally work on. So I work with the creative community at the White House. We ended up producing this video called Between Two Ferns. Do you guys remember that weird video with Zach Galifianakis and President Obama? Yeah. So that video, that very weird video, actually helped enroll a ton of people at a time when the healthcare.gov website didn't work for 2 months. We had to figure out, how do you actually get young people to go to this website? And this company, Funny or Die, which is Will Ferrell's comedy company, we produced this video with them. And that's actually where I work now. I work at Funny or Die. So it's kind of awkward telling my mom that my boss was President Obama, and then my boss is Will Ferrell, the guy who's in his underwear all the time. My mom didn't quite get that. But no, so that's the work that we do. We work with all kinds of organizations, NGOs, foundations, candidates, campaigns. And we really try, and this is the work that we did at the White House. You know, it's crazy, but we really didn't view our work as partisan. We didn't just worry about the 32% of our base and bully the other, whatever number of percentage that didn't agree with us. Most of our job was figuring out a way to actually, in a way, culturally hack the system and figure out validators, people that aren't Barack Obama, people that, because whatever we were going to do, half the country was going to hate whatever we did, right? I mean, Michelle Obama had a campaign just trying to get kids to exercise and eat healthy, and half the country hated that. So it didn't matter what it was. This media environment is partisan. So a lot of my job was figuring out, okay, how do we get country Western stars talking about this issue? How do we get, you know, in the case of OPE, we're always thinking about the business community or the rural community, farmers, people who, a lot of the rural or a lot of moms trusted, as opposed to Barack Obama. And so, and a lot of our success, quite honestly, we didn't take credit for, right? I mean, a lot of the success when it came to ACA enrollment, or when it came to My Brother's Keeper, which is the President's Foundation, it really was the blocking and tackling of organizations and influencers on the ground. So I think that, you know, the work that I do is comedy. I have a very biased perspective of how powerful comedy is right now. So if anyone wants to work with Funny or Die, call me up. We work with everyone, and we figure out ways to make your campaigns entertaining and engaging, and fire people up to take action. So now that turned into a plug for Funny or Die, but yeah, it's a lot of fun.
You know, it's interesting when you're talking about telling stories, because I would have answered this question very differently before the Kavanaugh hearings. And because we've always really centered in the work that the feminist movement has always really centered survivor stories. And we always talked about the personal as political, and we always told our stories. And we also always knew in work on violence against women that it is an issue that can open up across partisan lines. And you can hear women across the board, and some men tell their stories of sexual violence. And there were Republicans on that Judiciary Committee that have been allies in the past on violence against women, because constituents came to them and told their stories. But I think we saw the limitation of the personal narrative. And interestingly, I just got back from Ireland last night. I was at an international summit on domestic violence, and it was the young people. I chaired a panel of a group of teenagers, and they challenged me and said, you know, what we just saw in the States was the limitation of personal narrative and the importance of linking personal narrative with policy changes. And I think it was the LGBT groups that did that the best when we were in the White House. It was those constituency groups who came in and said, okay, here's my story, but here's what you need to do about it. And it was really on point, and it was really solid. And I think that's part of the reason we made so much progress in that way. So storytelling, yes. our stories, our personal stories, our country's stories, but also what those stories mean to policy.
Yeah.
I pass it to Gautam just because.
No, I agree completely.
I referenced him, but.
Good.
Public
How do you
engagement.
engage?
What advice do you have for us trying to engage different publics around the country?
Use this one.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh.
It's on.
I mean, I guess we've talked a little bit about this over the course of the panels we've done for this book. But I would say that at the moment, it seems like we're kind of in an echo chamber a little bit. Like we talk about all of these stories, but we're really not convincing anyone. It's almost like we're not really trying to convince the other side who feels the opposite. It's like we're just trying to fire up our base, essentially, is what seems to be happening. And I feel like in order to kind of fix this polarization that we're seeing, we really need to figure out a way to chip away at that a little bit. And it's hard to do because people feel like if they do that, they're going to empower the other side to just attack them more. But both sides have to be complicit in the effort to do that. I'm not sure at what point we get there. You know, it seems like after several bomb attempts on former public officials, that was sort of conversation that's constructive and not destructive, but that remains to be seen. So.
Turn it back over to Gautam. It's striking with this book of the diverse perspectives that you bring to it. Talk to us a little bit more about your strategy behind that and why, again, right now, that is just so critically important that we hear those perspectives.
Yeah, so I have two ways of answering that. One is that it is an authentic, accurate representation of what our team looked like. We see these pictures of these all white male internship classes. You kind of wonder, how is that even possible? At some point, it doesn't make any sense. But I think it is. So first of all, it was a reflection of the diversity of the team, and that was not accidental, right? There was certainly a broad coalition of people who worked for and campaigned for Barack Obama and helped get him elected. But having that kind of inclusive staff is also a reflection of the amount of work that went into recruiting talent, networking, stepping outside people's usual comfort zones or usual networks, making sure they were reaching all kinds of people. So it was important for us that if we were going to try and capture the essence of the Obama White House, that we really had voices and experiences that reflected that. The second part, though, is we had a saying in our White House that was "People are policy," which was meant to capture this idea that when you have people who reflect the American public at the decision-making table, you get policy outcomes that reflect the American public, that best serve the American people. And that was something we said on every issue. I mean, certainly, and I should mention what I did. I worked as the president's liaison to the LGBTQ community and the Asian American community, and on every issue that I worked on, I mean, just on LGBT issues, whether it was marriage equality or workplace discrimination or international issues, we had someone from the community who was involved in that process, who was, whether it was in their job description or not, spoke up and said, here's what my community needs, here's what our experiences are, our challenges. And you can see that across the board with so many different issues, that when you had, we had people who were willing to, who were not just there, but also willing to speak up, that we ended up seeing policy changes that really did serve all the people that the White House is supposed to serve. So that was really a big part of why this collection came together in this way. We sat down and made a list of 60 people who had terrific stories, and then made sort of a wish list from that. And I just started calling people and pitching them, and everyone said yes. And then it was just a matter of herding a bunch of cats, but that was relatively the easy part of it.
Just to follow up on that, did you have to get approval by President Obama to write this?
So we did not have to, but we did seek it. In fact, one of the very first thing I did was, so this process started at the very end of 2016, and then in early January, many of us went to the president's farewell address in Chicago. And so while I was there, I took the opportunity to talk to everyone, Valerie Jarrett, who we all worked for, Dennis McDonough, senior staff, did not go to the president himself, but basically checked with everybody, said, Is this something that you think you'd be proud of? Would you have any concerns? This is not meant to be some sensational tell-all. We're not breaking news. And really, we're not trying to tell his story. We're trying to tell our stories. And everyone was, universally very supportive. So we wanted to make sure that we did this in a way that really honored his legacy.
I think I'll turn it over to the audience here. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So, over here.
Thanks. How do you account for the difficulty of dealing with the other half of the country that was against whatever you did? And how have you processed whatever emotions you have about that post-2016?
I'll start. In my chapter, I talk about my father. My dad is African-American, Vietnam War vet, grew up in segregated Oklahoma City, fought in 2 wars, and he's a Republican, and he voted for Donald Trump. So my Thanksgiving dinners are always a little awkward. I write about in the book calling my father and telling him that I got a job at the Obama White House. And in my head, I'm thinking like, my dad is going to be so proud, And he was very confused. It's like, what? So no, I think that my experience growing up was, I was surrounded by a lot of Republicans, and I was surrounded by people, and I wouldn't call them Republicans, I'd say conservatives. And I think, my father's story is one where he really beat the odds, and he believed he beat the odds because he just worked harder than everyone else, and that no one has an excuse. And he sounds a lot like Kanye West, actually. Like my dad and Kanye should hang out. But no, I do think, I agree a lot with what Raina said. I do think that, I sometimes find my friends who are just used to talking to people that agree with them. They're used to sort of preaching to the choir, that their ideas and their arguments get lazy. Because you need to hear the other side, right? You need to hear their arguments, their best arguments, in order for our arguments to be better. And because our media environment is so partisan and so bifurcated, who wants to watch Fox News? Right? It's hard. I do. My wife turns it off every time she comes home, but I think it gets very hard for each of us to hear a lot of times misinformation, and also it hurts to hear someone view your life or the people that you love or who you are and assume you have bad intentions, right? It just gets politics has gotten very personal. And what I try to do, especially around friends and family who don't agree with my politics, is make it personal with them and to explain how these issues and policies, how me, Brad Jenkins, not Nancy Pelosi or, these, political parties or whatever it is, but just to make it very personal. And I think what I'm seeing, I do a lot of events and I go on college campuses and I talk. I do see this younger generation hunger for the conversation because they're not seeing it. They're not seeing sort of an honest, I don't even know what the right term is. You watch, nothing against cable news fans, but I can't watch cable news because it's just people yelling at each other. And I think what that ends up doing is it turns off a whole generation of people because they think of politics as just people yelling at each other. And that's the opposite of politics. Politics, as Gautam put it, public service in and of itself is just serving the people and just doing the best that we can incrementally. And our job, a lot of my job was sitting down with Republicans and sitting down with people that didn't agree with us and figuring out, we may disagree on 80% of things, but there might be 20% that we agree on. So let's figure out a way to move the ball on the 20%. So, Van Jones is a friend and he's gotten all this flack because he's been working with the Trump White House on prison reform. Van has been doing this his entire career. He's been working on this issue in Oakland. And he said 30 years ago, I will work with anyone who wants to work with me on this issue. And he's doing it right now. And he is getting torched on Twitter. I mean, people are saying awful things about him, but he doesn't care. Because for him, if we can just make incremental progress, yes, it's awful to stand next to people like Jared Kushner. Nothing, if there's anyone's offended by what I'm saying, sorry, but it's an awful thing. But at the end of the day, if it means that there can be incremental progress on this issue, he's willing to do it. And I think, I agree with Raina, I think we as, especially people who've worked in the Obama White House, we weren't torch throwers, right? Obama always took the long-term view. It was never, let's just do something because it'll look good. In my opinion, I think this is going to sound crazy. I don't want to sound like Susan Sarandon here, but I do think that Donald Trump being elected president has woken up women to run for office in record numbers, young people to get involved in record numbers. I think in 12 days, it's going to be a great outcome. So I sort of take the long-term view as well. And I think I urge you, I can guarantee everyone in here has a Republican friend, right? Raise your hand. How many of you actually talk to your Republican friends? See that? Well, this is we're also in like a very, I was just going to say,
this is a bias.
This is a very unique audience, right. But keep doing it. Like, don't give up on your friends and family. Just keep engaging, because I think you guys are the models. And I think the more, especially younger people, see people willing to have those conversations, the better we'll be.
Can I just add, if there are Republicans here, talk to your Democratic.
No, that's true. Right.
But no, I think I would agree with all of that. To answer, the second part of your question, how do you sort of grapple with this? I mean, I think I don't mind rough and tumble politics, right? Like, let's have the debate. Let's talk about our values. Let's talk about our policy solutions. What is harder for me to watch is the sort of the attack on the institutions, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's the press or bureaucracy, the civil service, on the processes that have been in place for a long time for good reason. I don't mind disrupting the norm, but I think what we're seeing is really cynical and gross. And if it's not checked, I do agree. Like I would like to follow President Obama's lead and take the long view and believe that all of these institutions have resilience because they've served us for so long. But I do think that at some point, if you don't check those things, and it can be by any person of any party, right? It doesn't have to be a partisan issue. I do think we need to have a course correction soon, or we risk that becoming the new normal.
What I just wanted to answer, because you mentioned Van Jones. So, going back to the very first year of the Obama administration, I every day at 5 o'clock watched Glenn Beck, because at that time he had that highest ranked show, and he had a picture. I was considered a czar on violence against women. So
right.
My picture was on the czar chart, but he never quite got down to me, except I would see on these obscure blogs, White House advisor on violence against women, feminist abortionist who supports castration to deal with sexual violence. I was like, okay, well, let me think. But we did it. So that was very tough. And Van, he's all the more remarkable because of what happened to him at the hands of Glenn Beck and the use of the media to distort what Van had said about working with young people. And so it was a terrible time in that first year, and the kind of attacks that we were experiencing in the media. But in the Obama second term, we passed one of the few pieces of successful legislation, the Violence Against Women Act. And it was a very big partisan fight. And it was around issues about LGBT rights and tribal sovereignty. But mostly it was about immigration. It was really one of the first really brutal shots across the bow. And the VAWA fight in 2013 was really about Republican proposals to gut the long-standing protections the Violence Against Women had for immigrant victims of crime. And so it really was a harbinger of things to come. But we won because really of the advocacy voices. I really believe that. I mean, we were right on the policy, but it was really the advocates who went out there across the aisle and built relationships in Congress. And a weird deal was made to get the bill passed, and I never quite understood what happened. But somebody told me that John Boehner said, this bill is not going down on my watch. And that was because of the pressure that he had gotten from advocacy groups. So it's just critical. You know, we also, all of us, I think, well, maybe not you, but most of us got yelled at by our constituency groups at various times because we weren't moving fast enough. We weren't doing enough. Government is very slow. I got yelled at by student activists who came and picketed us. You know, it's like, what? I'm being picketed, actually. I've never been the subject of a picket. I have myself picketed quite a lot. But it really was about keeping those, like, as much as we got yelled at sometimes by our constituency groups, we always kept those doors open.
Yeah.
There was no one that we said couldn't come in and see us again because they had yelled at us. And so I think that partnership between your friends and allies in government and advocacy groups is just going to be essential, you know, sort of once we're back in power.
I agree.
But you didn't get yelled at.
I did.
Oh, yeah.
I'd be interested in hearing what kind of advice would you give to the Democratic Party at the moment about how to reach those sort of a blue-collar, white working men, or do you think they are sort of a lost cause to the Democratic Party?
I'm happy. It's a great question. I think a couple of things, right? So one thing I would say we should not do is to assume that it has to be a blue-collar, white, working-class man who talks to those voters, right? I don't think that's the case. You know, we say this all the time, and I think, and this is not just advice for the Democratic Party, I think this is advice for politicians, is talk about your values, right? Talk about, go to people where they are. Don't come at them with a partisan policy solution, but talk about what you believe in, what you believe American values are, what you personally value, and let the conversation flow from there. I think we would be better served if we talk more about those underlying issues. I mean, when we're talking about things like manufacturing and automation, that means having a really hard conversation about truths and the way that the global economy is moving, and lying to people and saying, oh, I'm going to somehow magically bring back your job that there no longer is space for in this economy I think is doing people a disservice, and it's also just lying. So I would much prefer that we have conversations that are based on, you know, values and truth. I know that sounds very simplistic, but
Yeah.
That would be my advice.
The other big thing that we forget, I think that there's always so much focus on that demographic, but the reality is half the country just doesn't vote. I mean, there's just gets a shrinking pie of, you know, yes, the blue collar white voters in these Midwest states that always vote, and maybe they vote for Obama and maybe they vote for Trump. The reality is, you know, particularly young people, they just never vote. But what we've seen with this past primary is record levels of voting, particularly younger people, people of color, and younger women. It just changes the game. Millennials are the largest eligible voting bloc right now that actually surpassed baby boomers. But it's crazy because if millennials actually voted at the rate of baby boomers, this country would fundamentally change overnight. And I think what you find, particularly the Democratic Party, and we have lots of friends at the DNC, but it just gets hard. It's this sort of vicious cycle of we're not going to invest in young people because they don't vote, right? But then if you don't invest in reaching young people, then they're not going to vote. So it's just this, you know, vicious cycle around and around we go. I think that what we're finding, particularly on digital, is it's a lot cheaper. You don't need television ads. Young people don't watch TV. So all of these billions of dollars that's spent making TV consultants very wealthy, it wouldn't reach young people anyway. So I think what you're finding with campaigns like Beto O'Rourke, I'm not sure if folks are watching what's happening in Texas, but something is happening in Texas. It's crazy that Beto's even within, you know, is somewhat close to this guy. Just looking at the raw voter registration numbers in Texas. And what he's doing is he's running a campaign that is innovative and disruptive. And he's doing everything on Facebook Live, whether he's in the In-N-Out parking lot, air drumming or skateboarding, but he's campaigning in a way that's innovative and he's telling a story. And I think that if he somehow, even if he doesn't win, I think what he's doing is he's writing a blueprint for how we engage an electorate that just does not vote. And I think, you know, the DNC and the Democratic Party's also done very thoughtful things on automatic voter registration, right? Making it easier for people to vote. All of those things, I think, are, again, sort of longer term view, because not to be mean or whatever, but, you know, older blue collar voters are old. They are. So, you know, yes, very ageist panel, by the way. I apologize. But there's a rising electorate that that I think we do need to focus on, because they're up for grabs. They're not Republicans or Democrats or independents. You know, they're up for grabs, and we have to reach them. By the way, I love older people.
Oh my God, that's the worst.
Question. What do you, 20 years down the road, 2038, what do you think public will remember as the Obama administration's greatest legacy or biggest accomplishment?
The tan suit.
By far.
LGBT issues in healthcare. Lightning round.
Yeah, I agree. I think healthcare.
Healthcare.
I agree, healthcare, but I also would say that for the tribal community, they remember Obama as like the best president ever. So on all things.
Well, and I should say, President Obama gave this first speech ever of a sitting president on sexual violence. It was in January of 2014. It grew out of the work that we were doing on sexual assault in the military, which I didn't write about in the chapter because it's a much longer story, that the president was highly engaged in that issue. And through that, he began to think about sexual violence across the board. And he gave an incredible speech, which I do write about, and what it was like as a survivor to sit and listen to a president give that speech was an incredible experience. So while in 30 years, we may not remember that this was the administration that sort of allowed the conversation we're having today to happen.
Yeah.
Hi, so I have two questions. The first is, you spoke about, you know, Democrats engaging with Republicans, engaging with Democrats. I know a lot of people who were Democrats who were working in the Obama administration and stayed. Maybe, you know, like didn't want to when this president went into office. But what are your like when you, and I'm sorry if I missed this, if you were a bit late, but what really like forced you out of that role, and like would you have stayed, or was it like such an internal struggle for you, or is there like this bigger purpose that you wish you stayed for? And then second question is if you ever plan on going back into toward that administration.
So on the first, so we were all political appointees. So when you're an appointee, you have an expiration date, right? So to answer your second question first, you know, 4 days after the election, I was supposed to start the Clinton transition team. So yes, I would have gone back in, and I would love to go back in. And one of the things I realize now in retrospect is the day I left my job at the White House was probably the day I was best at my job, right? You get good at this stuff. You learn how government works. You learn how regulation and comment periods and all these things that I had no idea about before. So I am like raging to go back in, and I have a to-do list, and I really do believe that more than any other sector, you know, the nonprofit sector, the private sector, that government can have the most positive impact on people's lives. So I would love to go back in the future administration. But to your first question, I think one of the things that's been really hard for us to see is a lot of our friends who are career or foreign service or even military are leaving. In part because some of it is political. They see what's happening at their agency or bureau, and they can't defend it. And so there's a point at which they feel like they just need to leave. Even though a lot of us would love for them to stay on the inside. This is not deep state stuff, but like these are people who are experts on their issues, and we lose their talent if we lose them. So it's been really hard to watch that. I mean, my husband is a career civil servant. He's still at the State Department, and he's good at the work that he does. He believes in it. It's not as partisan as some of the other issues we've talked about. So he wants to stay because he thinks he can have the most effect there.
The brain drain out of the civil servants is of great concern to me, and the work that I do, because there's such institutional knowledge and people who made it through the Bush administration, people who really understood these issues have left. And I think it's going to take us a very long time to rebuild the capacity within the federal government. It won't be easy. You know, I was political as well. So in fact, I left before the end. I had been there 5.5 years. And I would go back in only for the sake of mentoring somebody else, because I do think issues of violence against women should be in the hands of younger women who are most affected by it. But I also I want somebody from the sector to come in, and not a government person so much as someone who's worked out there on the front lines. But I also don't want them to have the same kind of very challenging first year that I had. I don't want to lose that time again. It's what you were saying. Like, if I could have a do-over. And so what I know now about once I learned it, I really learned it. Once I got it, I really got it. And having been there for 5.5 years, I was really valuable in how you get things done. So I would go back to mentor somebody else so they wouldn't have a whole year of thinking they were about to be fired at any second.
Yeah, I would say that I'm extremely concerned about the brain drain as well. I have Republican friends who are with the administration who are not political appointees, they're full-time, career staff. Even they have left for the most part, not because of, well, part of the politics, but also because this state have just been bleeding people like crazy. They have no real good internal structure anymore. They don't feel like they are able to be effective at their jobs. And so it's just purging all these folks, regardless of their politics, out of the civil service. And I think that's going to be impactful for decades and decades to come, because as everyone has said on the panel, it takes you a certain number of years to become proficient and a certain number of years to become an expert in what you're working on. And most importantly, to understand how to navigate the federal government so you can be effective at pushing the issues forward that you're pushing. In terms of going back into the government, I don't think I wouldn't go back in right now, obviously, even if there were a Democrat in the White House. I think that I spent 7.5 years at the White House, and many of us spent similar amounts of time. But for me, you kind of lack some flexibility when you're in the administration, and it's not a huge deal at first, the first few years, but it started to wear on me a lot after a while, that you have to, every paragraph you draft has to go through this review process and go through the agencies, and there's just this bureaucratic process that has to take place. So for me, that became very draining. And I feel like I will get over that. I will get over being tired of that part of it, because that was really the only part that I didn't like as much. But once that wears off, I think I would definitely go back in.
Following up on this kind of discussion, what do you think Democrats could do in the future to get the show on the road faster in their administration? Because I know, where I work, that there was often no great pressure to finish things up. And, then it becomes harder to implement those things under the next administration. So I often have the feeling that with the Obama administration, that they took a long time to get started on things. Mm-hmm. And those are valuable years, because you don't get them back if the political party changes. So in addition to finding votes, I think the question is to effectively use the time that we have right from the get-go. And I think Republicans do a better job of that.
So I have 3 ways of answering that. I'll be quick. The first is, in the context, when we started the administration, I started at the Pentagon for the first 2.5 years. And in fact, one of the things I was working on was recruiting talent and staffing up the agency. There was a reluctance to go back to the Clinton people, right? We had just finished this hard-fought primary, and it was there was a sense of we're not going to the past, we're moving forward. We don't need that. We can start with fresh thinking, which ended up not really being true, right? You need to hire the people who know what they're doing. So that was, I think, mistake 1. The second mistake, in my opinion, was the lobbyist ban, and I am all about removing corruption and the revolving door, but a lot of lobbyists are really good people who do important work on important issues. They're not all whatever the stereotype of the lobbyist is. And I think we made a huge mistake there, because there were really talented people who we could have used, who know how government works, and would have been a huge help, especially those first couple of years. The third thing is not a mistake, but it's something that I'm glad to see is happening now. This is why the advocacy community is so important right now, is to keep track of what's happening, what's changed, what's been sort of rolled away. And so we need to have those to-do lists on day 1, and not wait until year 2 or 3 to know what we're doing, what our marching orders are.
time maybe for one more question, please.
Yes, hi. I'm a big fan of the Obama family, and I'm all for working for the Obamas. But my question is, I mean, the book seems very interesting. What was actually the objectives that got you to write this book? Was it inspirational? Was it educational? Was it about politics? I mean, what was the main inspiration to go ahead and obviously you don't have a writing background, you have different backgrounds, but to do something like this, what was it that got you together to do this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is in the preface of the book, so I'll let you read that. But I mean, it's all the things you said, right? It was capturing what made the Obama White House special. It was telling stories about how change happens on the inside. It was, showing, really demonstrating the value of people from diverse lives and experiences and who didn't come from power and privilege, what it means to hire them and have them work in the White House. And part of it was like Obama nostalgia and some inspiration for the future. The weird thing is, much to the chagrin of the publishers at Penguin Books, this book landed the week of the Kavanaugh, of his hearing and Dr. Ford's testimony. So not an ideal media landscape for a book to land in. However, what we've heard from a lot of people since is that hopefully this is a little bit of a reprieve from all the cynicism and nastiness and distrust that we see. And I didn't mention this earlier, so I'll mention now because I know we're almost done, is that all the proceeds from the book are going to Civic Nation, which is a nonprofit organization that houses all the Obama White House legacy initiatives. So It's on Us, the United States of Women, Reach Higher, Better Make Room. These are all various initiatives that we worked on, in part because we felt like it'd be weird to write a book about public service and then try to make money off of it. So it all goes there.
Well, a lot of people do that.
People do that, yeah. It's funding a thing called the Hope Incubator, which is a new fund at Civic Nation that will provide seed funding and access and coaching to people on the ground doing good work on all these issues that we care about. So thank you for asking the question, though. It's a great way to pitch the book at the end.
So I wanna okay. We'll do a little lightning round. You both ask your question and then we'll do lightning round.
Because you guys have moved on, and of course the book is about your greatest achievements and how great it was to work with the Obama administration. And it was a great question also about you guys would like to go back if you had a chance to go back and work for the administration or for government. But what I would like to know is, having said all this and having heard all this, and former President Obama is still quite a young person. So if you would ever have a chance to work with him again, and if your path would cross, and you would have the chance, would you take it?
Can you ask your question?
Oh, yes. So a record number of federal district court judges approved under this administration. Any regrets about sort of, it almost seems like the record number of things and the how quickly things happen under the Trump administration. Wondering why sort of the seems like the framework foundation was not there to achieve things as quickly in the Obama administration, right? Like, for the first 2 years of his administration, you all were in the majority. So why at that time weren't there a record number of progressive federal judges approved? Like, what happened?
Yeah.
Where did the ball drop in terms of getting things
Great
done?
question.
I'll take that one first. I actually worked on judicial noms, but I joined the Obama administration later. A huge part of it, and this is the answer that I think a lot of advocates on whatever issue, pick an issue that you care about that we didn't address in those first couple of years, was that we were shedding 750,000 jobs per month, and our country was in a free fall. And we forget that, like it's almost collective amnesia, how bad it was. I mean, our banking system, our housing system, the stock market, everything, our auto industry, everything was in free fall. And there was a lot of work in just rescuing the economy, just to get us back to a place where people weren't concerned that, they can get money from their ATM. It was that ugly. And so a lot of our political capital was spent getting a bipartisan Recovery Act done, which actually didn't end up becoming bipartisan. And then, of course, the ACA, trying to get a bipartisan healthcare bill done, which didn't end up becoming bipartisan. So, But at the time, there were a lot of red state Democrats. They were practically Republicans. So the idea that we had this supermajority and we could just do single payer and just get it all done, the makeup of the House was just very different. The makeup of the Senate was very different. A lot has changed, I think. We have, as a party, moved to the left. But I mean, we all have friends who worked in leg affairs, and we know the president. I mean, the amount of work that went into getting the Recovery Act done, getting the auto industry recovered, getting the ACA done, which is the signature legislative achievement. I mean, no president had done it in several decades. We wish we could have done more. We wish we could have got immigration done. We wish we could have done more judges. The president did, we did make up for a lot of lost time in his second term, particularly around judicial nominations. We nominated and confirmed the most diverse and progressive bench in history. But you bring up a very good point. The Trump administration was ready on day one. And they also, because of the filibuster and because of them not paying attention to the blue slip, they were just, you're right, they're just confirming them so quickly. So if we could turn back time, it would be great if we can do all those things at once, but unfortunately we just couldn't. And I can't remember what the first question was.
Do you want to, I'm happy to take a stab. I mean, never say never, right? I mean, Lynn and I still do work for Vice President Biden, but I will take it in a slightly different direction though, which is, after the election, Michael Strautmanis, who writes in this book as well, who's known the Obamas for 30 years since he was a paralegal for Mrs. Obama back at the Austin in Chicago. He was speaking to a bunch of us because we were feeling pretty crappy. And he said, look, we have to stop asking Barack and Michelle Obama to save the world. Like, they have done enough. Like, they gave plenty of their time and energy and family to public service. And so I love the president, but I think we should also all be looking towards who's next, right? Who's that next person who's going to propel us into and give us a hopeful, inspiring vision of America. And maybe he or she is
Gautam Raghavan
is getting elected this November, right? Like, the bench of people who are coming up who are answering his call to service is really exciting to me. So I think I'm more excited about who's that next person who we just haven't found yet.
Any guesses?
Michelle Obama.
Yes, I would go back to work for Obama if the right position rose. Now, the courts issue, it is very important, especially with what happened with Kavanaugh. And I mean, I think we're nearing 100 federal judges that will be Trump appointees already at this time, which is crazy compared to what we had under Obama. And they're just cruising along. So I think I heard a statistic the other day that 1 in 6 folks sitting on the bench right now are Trump appointees because of this massive influx of appointees going in. So it's a real problem. And what's worse is that it's fairly easy to get folks interested in engaging on Supreme Court nominees. It's very, very different trying to get folks to engage on lower court nominees. It's just, that's something I've been working on through my business, and it's an uphill battle because you got to show folks how this is going to affect your life directly, right? And if there's a current pending Supreme Court case, or there was one recently, or there's one possibly coming up, folks can see that connection pretty clearly. But when it's a lower court judge, it's difficult to land that. So I feel like we need to get folks more interested and more educated over time right now on why it matters and making those direct connections.
Yeah, I work for the Biden Foundation now. I'm the head of the Violence Against Women work there. And just yesterday, Vice President Biden was on a call with thousands of students talking about getting engaged in campaigns to end sexual assault on college campuses. So my job there is to work with him to continue the issues that he felt so strongly about in the White House.
Great. Well, if you would all join me in extending a round of applause for him. Appreciate you all taking the time this evening. We do have books for sale here if you're interested, and I know the panel would be generous in signing them if that's of interest. Please help yourself to food and drink. And I wanted to just call out also on the left-hand side, we have a little what we call a dip jar. And if you feel inspired to help us continue to help promote a better image of the U.S. abroad at this time that we're working so hard on through international exchanges. Always welcome your support. So please enjoy yourselves and get to know some of our panelists. Thanks.
Thank you.
My car is downstairs.
That's a statistic that always scares me. It's all the judges, man.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Yeah, just tonight,
Thank you so
but otherwise
much.
I'd love to
Appreciate it.
stay.
You're great. I have to run to my kids.
Oh, yeah.
But thank you. I'd love to hear more about what you guys are doing. I'd love to figure out a way to keep in touch. Yeah.
I was watching
Thank
your Zach Obama video the
So
other night.
funny.
I hadn't
It's so
seen it when it
funny.
came out.
Remember when presidents laughed?
Or had a sense of humor.
As an old person,
Oh,
I do
you're
have
right.
a sense
Hi.
of humor.
Oh, thank you.
And,
It's nice to meet you.
I worked with
Oh my God, I love that.
a production company in DC.
Yeah.
I wanted to brief it with them and
Yeah.
it's amazing.
I love it.
Oh, that's great. We've done 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God, thank you.
That makes it interesting.
And actually,
That's awesome.
I'm
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, we're doing, our company's doing a big.
My dad's from Ghana.
Okay.
My dad is Clinton, Obama supporter.
So we've been all over the country doing these get out and
Okay.
rallies.
So it's like, you know,